and welcome to this very informative and interesting webinar. We have two wonderful guests this afternoon. One is Sister Mūmbi Kīgūtha, precious blood sister from Dayton, Ohio. She's a Kenyan native, and she brings a wealth of experience with the United Nations Refugee Agency, Jesuit Refugee Services, and other groups. She has a master's in marketing and commerce and a master's in justice ministry from Catholic Theological Union. She is the new director of Friends in Solidarity, and she's committed to building the capacity of young people in South Sudan. Recently, she spent a month in South Sudan with Solidarity, arriving along with the Pope, who was there on an ecumenical pilgrimage. She will be interacting with Paul Jeffrey. Paul Jeffrey is a photojournalist who's filed stories and photos from 90 countries, including South Sudan. He generously shares photos of his work in South Sudan with Solidarity, and was also the one who developed the 10th anniversary video for Solidarity. His work can be found at paul@kairosphotos.com. What we don't often hear about is Paul and his wife, Lyda Pierce, are retired United Methodist missionaries. He is torn right now between being a photojournalist and playing with his new grandson, Logan, known on Facebook as the little guy. So before we get into the conversation around Paul's wonderful photos, with which Mūmbi will be interacting, I want to read a poem from Mike Bassano, Father Mike Bassano, a Maryknoll missionary, part of Solidarity, who works in Malakal in the UN camp. In his free time, he writes poetry. So this one is titled Envisioning. Raising hands upward, summoning inner strength, overcoming insidious hatred, determined to keep loving. Gun violence raging, families grieving, innocent children gone, senseless killing abound. Breathing your spirit into our very lives, cause for rejoicing, united together. Courageously facing momentous challenges, believing something new, birthing among us. Compassion blossoming for people of goodwill, standing for truth against heartless war. Seeking elusive peace within our grasp, positive attitude of endless possibilities. Altering the course of what has been, envisioning profound dreams of a better world on the horizon. So with that, Paul and Mūmbi, I hand it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and I assume you all can hear me and see my screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, that's a big progress. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Mūmbi and Susan, those of you who made this possible. Thanks for the invitation to come and share. What I'd like to do is, in the next few minutes, share about 20-some photos. I've taken thousands of photos in South Sudan, over 10 visits since 2007, the first time I went there, when it was still Southern Sudan. And so what I did here was I just picked a handful that reflect a little bit about the work that Solidarity does, what impresses me about it, and the context within which it takes place, a context which has changed over the years. Yeah, and in doing so, a real appreciation I want to express for Solidarity. Solidarity has, in many of the times I've been in South Sudan, functioned as a family, if you will. I've stayed at Solidarity houses I've been friends with Solidarity staff. You've introduced me to folks. Later on, there's a photo, which isn't mine, of people eating around a Solidarity table. In many ways, that's become symbolic for me of that table, of where to meet folks. If I want to do a story about what's going on in South Sudan, all I have to do is sit at a Solidarity table for dinner. And there are people at that table because Solidarity is part of this larger family of the church, of civil society, who serve to me as guides into that. So I want to start with looking at a handful of themes which form some of the context around, there we go. One is just a note about the climate crisis. It's one of the elements that make up South Sudan today, which I think is underreported. I think it's been underreported in several of the region's conflicts. When I reported on Darfur back early in this century, in many ways, Darfur was the first climate crisis war, because the climate crisis was forcing pastoralists further south into areas that had traditionally belonged to farmers, causing conflicts that were then sort of exacerbated by the ruling elites who decided to use some of the nomads to press their own political and military agendas. And you can see that happening in South Sudan today. For example, right now, with the rain that's falling in Jonglei, heavy rain, heavier than usual, part of one of the consequences of climate change, you're seeing pastoralists forced out of Jonglei into some of the Equatorial region, into areas that they haven't gone before. And that inevitably creates a conflict. And when you've got folks around who want to take advantage of those conflicts, it's a recipe for disaster. So I think we, going forward, need to pay more attention to the climate crisis. I try to use the term climate crisis, which is what the Pope does in Laudato Si, rather than climate change. I think we need to pay attention more to that and see how our ministries can work at mitigating that. Another element that makes up South Sudan's the context for Solidarity's ministry has to do with the relationship between different tribes. In some ways, that's been a bit exaggerated, sensationalized in the media, but it's not hard to see, if you spend time in South Sudan, that people identify a lot with their tribes, if for no other reason than a lot of folks like the Nuer use facial scarification as part of their self-identity. And those tribal relationships or tensions or conflicts, first of all, we need to take note that they were taken advantage of by colonial powers, who had Britain in this case had a divide and conquer strategy. But since then, they're not the only ones that did that. And the new rulers of South Sudan have learned their lesson well from the colonial masters. And we see this tension between tribes being used to justify political violence. I'll get later on to how Solidarity plugs into that. Another problem in South Sudan is the ubiquitous nature of weaponry. And we've seen the expansion of that, and it's made things worse. So for example, you have in some cultures in South Sudan a tradition of cattle raising. It's what young men do to prove their manhood. They go out and they steal some cows from a neighboring tribe. And in the past, they did that with bows and arrows or with rocks, and they maybe got in a fight, and a few people got beat up, but seldom did people get killed. Nowadays, because of the ever-present the presence of heavy weaponry like AK-47s, cattle raids that before were just kind of a pastime among teenagers have now turned into massacres at times. And that's spilled over into everyday life. Ordinary conflicts, when there's guns around, end up being used, and they get used with disastrous consequences. Another element of South Sudan's context is corruption. This photo is from 2010, when people were registering for the referendum on independence. And there was a lot of pride and hope then. You could see it in this woman's face. This is in Yambio, as they registered to vote, that the future was going to be really different. The future hasn't turned out to be quite as different as they'd hoped, for a variety of reasons. And a lot of that has to do with corruption, with the resource curse that plagues Africa, with what some people call the big man syndrome. And if you've ever been in offices of people in government officials in South Sudan, you understand what the big man syndrome is. that corruption penetrates through everything. I've experienced it as a journalist. When I first went to South Sudan, I flew to Yei from Uganda. I got a visa in Uganda in a day and then flew to Yei, and there was a guy under a tree that stamped my passport and let me into the country. Nowadays, you have to go through this elaborate process that involves a lot of money. It involves a government media office, which keeps an eye on what you do. 1 year, I couldn't get my visa until I sat down with a guy in Juba who went through a thick file of everything he could find that I had written and photographed and lectured me about how I had mischaracterized his country in a variety of ways. So there's part of this corruption is a real attempt to control the media, and people getting really upset when the media doesn't toe the line. And that's part of blaming foreigners for a lot of the problems. So there's a variety of things that go into corruption in South Sudan. So climate crisis, tribal conflicts, weaponry, corruption, create an environment in which the church has played a fascinating role. And John Ashworth recently wrote a book, which I recommend about it, but we see the church taking a variety of roles today. One is providing relief, succor to people who have suffered. This is a family in Wau who've been displaced. They're living in the cathedral grounds in Wau, eating meager rations, along with, at the time this photo was taken, tens of thousands of people who had crowded into the church grounds, escaping conflict around them. So the church has done, I think, a good job with the resources it has had of trying to provide relief to people who suffer. It's also, at its most creative points, tried to mitigate those conflicts and attack some of the underlying causes. This is a photo from Kūrōn, the Peace Village, which was sponsored by the Catholic Church in Kūrōn. It's a bridge which was constructed in an area where tribes had been fighting for years, and the bishop there decided to build a bridge to facilitate communication between groups who had been fighting with each other. And the bridge has become in some ways a symbol of when people communicate better, get along better, cooperate better on economic projects and on development, that the level of violence goes down. So the church in South Sudan, at its best, has done an excellent job of not just providing relief to those who are hurting, but also trying to resolve some of the conflicts that create that suffering in the first place. Now, here comes the role of solidarity. From my perspective, and Mūmbi interrupted me, otherwise I'll just keep spieling on here. Solidarity, I think, did a good job of looking for strategic places to leverage the little bit of resources and personnel that it brought to the country. And rather than, as is the tradition in much of Africa, where religious congregations came in and founded their own schools and their own institutions, it decided that training teachers would be an important role in this new country. And so it has done that. And you will find those teachers throughout the country working in government schools and church-run schools in a variety of places. And there, I think this is an excellent example of using strategically using resources to affect change, to make possible change. This woman, by the way, is Joana Hilario, who's a graduate of the Solidarity Teacher Training College in Yambio. Another place it's provided sort of a strategic intervention is in healthcare. Again, at the moment of birth of this new nation, it could have tried to do what religious congregations often do, which is come in and build clinics and hospitals. Instead, it said, look, let's help the government to do its job. Let's provide healthcare personnel, in particular nurses and midwives, that will help staff the government clinics or church-run clinics. And so it's trained midwives like the woman in the red, who is Regina Bangiarego, who's delivering a child in the Kamboni Hospital. Alongside her, by the way, is Monica Nowicka, who's a midwife from Poland, who was a short-term volunteer with Solidarity. And behind her is a woman in the white scrubs, Veronica Juma, who's a traditional birth attendant. There's sort of a fascinating drama around this because traditional birth attendants are oftentimes the ones outside of urban centers who help women deliver babies, but they oftentimes don't have real training. So training midwives has been an important element in providing for safe deliveries. Traditional birth attendants have their role, but they needed more training. We've tried to provide Solidarity has tried to train more midwives. When I was taking this photo, the traditional birth attendant sort of forced her way into the photo. She wanted her photo taken too. And in some ways, to me, it's symbolic of some of the tensions around when you create this new professional corps. You get people who've traditionally played that role may feel left out of the picture at times. And it's been a real challenge how you train new folks while you also work with traditional folks, not marginalizing them, but letting them learn and grow and participate as well. So education, healthcare, another, I think, strategic niche that Solidarity has played, and they may not have sort of figured this out at the beginning, but it came particularly through some of the personnel that came early, like Kathy Arata, who was one of the people from the beginning, is trauma healing. How do you help people who have lived through the trauma of war and all that means to overcome that? And they do that oftentimes in workshops using the Capacitar model, helping people use their body and listen to their body to get through that and to heal and to move beyond healing into building peace in a variety of ways.
Just to jump,
Yes,
Paul, and just to bring home some of these points you're making from my visit. You know, when you talk about weaponry, I remember being at the little airstrip in Yambio waiting to go back to Juba. And there are no scanners for luggage. So you tend to open your luggage and have it checked physically. But the immigration officer was to an officer with a gun across his legs. And it was an AK-47. And then in your head, you have all these questions going on. Why is this necessary? Why should there be a gun in a little room where you're searching whether people have carried illegal things? But the lack of clarity, like rifles are a show of power, and you will bump into people carrying guns who look like they're 17 years of age, who look so worn out and tired. And part of the trauma in South Sudan is that the escalation into shouting and violence is so rapid that you are always worried even to engage in a conversation about you're doing what is wrong or these are my rights. Because when you're facing somebody with a gun who's traumatized, whose automatic response is always to shout and argue and fight, you're always in a vulnerable position. So, and as I said this, I've traveled in many parts of Africa, but in South Sudan, I always bit my tongue because I was always scared of saying something that would land me into trouble. And especially when so many of the officers around me would have guns. I arrived a few hours before the Pope, and the presence of guns just within the airport in arrivals was mind-boggling. And you know, when you talk about the climate crisis, I was very saddened to see the road to Yambio to Juba is currently under construction. But what is happening, they're clearing huge swaths of the teak tree, like almost a kilometer long apart on the road. And so you see this landscape of these trees that are being pulled down, and the amount of charcoal burning that happens because it's the only cheap source of fuel. So it's this delicate, again, balance between how do you provide a sustainable source of fuel that is affordable for a country that has so many poor people, where the cutting down of trees means that the climate crisis is actually going to be accelerated in so many parts of South Sudan because of this very need. Yet I did not see a tree nursery anywhere or people planting trees where these year-old trees were being cut down. When you say corruption, as Samuel, who works at our Juba office, kept repeating to me, South Sudan has now been ranked the most corrupt country in the world. Imagine we are now even worse than Somalia. And the contrast is shocking because you hear of people earning the equivalent of $4 a month. These are government officials, these are teachers, these are police officers, etc. But then in Juba, you see all these high-end vehicles driven by the country's elite, a minority, but the country's elite. And so if salaries are nothing that anybody could live on in any part of the world, what solutions lie therein but for people to be corrupt, just to try and survive? As we speak, many South Sudanese cannot even guarantee a simple meal per day, one simple meal per day. So then you ask, what is the solution to this kind of need, if not corruption? Because the wealth sharing agreements that had been hoped for when South Sudan became an independent country, that continue to be hoped for when you see vice presidents representing all the major tribes and everybody's hope is pinned on them that everybody will get a piece of the national wealth, have not come to pass in any way at all. So thank you, Paul.
Okay, and Mūmbi, don't let me keep rattling on. Jump in earlier. You
I
know,
will.
when you talk about having to bite your tongue, if you want to guarantee that men with guns will get upset, you put a photographer in front of them who starts taking photos. People with guns tend to not like photographs for some reason, so I've had to bite my tongue a lot too. But I give thanks for some of the folks in Solidarity who've been there a while, because if someone tells you that you can't take a picture in a certain place, there are oftentimes ways around that. And we make ways to make photos happen. And I could share countless examples of Solidarity folks who've been in their locations for a while, understanding some of the nuances of who's who and where's where, and helping me to do what I've done. Yeah. So let me move on. One other sort of strategic place where Solidarity leveraged its intervention in South Sudan has to do with sustainable agriculture. This wasn't necessarily something that was on the drawing board at the beginning, but it became sort of self-evident when they started a small farm near Rimenze. And the idea of the farm was to grow crops that could be used to feed students at the school in Yambio, a ways away. But they learned quickly that a lot of the people who live in that area had been displaced by the Civil War and then by the conflict afterwards. And a lot of agricultural skills that those communities possessed had atrophied over the years. And so it was helping people learn some new ways of farming, at times more efficient, and feeding themselves. And at times bringing in some new foods, like the famous sweet potatoes that Rosa Telibong, a Vietnamese member of Solidarity, brought in, that basically helped to feed thousands of people when there was a famine. Nothing else was growing except the sweet potatoes that she brought in. She also brought in some food crops that maybe weren't the most appropriate for that environment, but it's not for lack of trying. So this whole thing of sustainable agriculture, which has blossomed since then, to me represents the ability of Solidarity to respond to new situations by developing new ministries. This, by the way, is Rosa. And I think of the model of Solidarity, and particularly for me, having lived in Latin America for many years, when I think about mission, I think about accompaniment. Accompaniment is the ability to live with people and to share their lot, that we don't show up with all the answers, that mission isn't something from the outside in, but something that we develop as we live and share with people. And Rosa, who recently left South Sudan after 14 years there, who learned Azande, maybe better than she learned English. She also had to learn English at the same time. To me, is an example of someone who embodies accompaniment. The community in Rimenze went through some really difficult times with people with guns invading their compounds, pushing them around. And when I asked Rosa why she didn't leave during the worst of that violence, she was just real clear when she said, we didn't run away. That wasn't our job to run away. They literally put their lives on the line. And so Rosa, who's a very small, diminutive woman, became, for many of us, a sort of larger than life character. And people in South Sudan miss her. I was there for her saying goodbye to the communities in which she'd worked. And it was a very tearful time. Another Solidarity member who to me embodies accompaniment is this guy. It's Mike Bassano, a Marino priest who someone mentioned earlier, who lives and works in the displaced camp at the UN base in Malakal. And here he's enjoying himself with some of the members of the dance group that he has in this Catholic church. A Catholic church which tries to blend the different tribes within the camp into one Catholic experience. Mike is somebody who got involved with the camp when all the other priests in Malakal left. And he was recently arrived there. He evacuated during the worst of the fighting, but he insisted on coming back quickly and ended up becoming essentially a chaplain, priest chaplain to this large displacement camp.
So just speaking to Mike, really, it's when everybody had to be evacuated, and he said, "I'll stay with the people." So he began staying at the UN, at the NGO compound, because whenever a crisis happens, all these NGOs rush into the place. And that time, in very difficult situations where they were sharing 8 people to a tent, the wash facilities were outside, and eventually a UN rep heard about Mike and invited him to live in the UN compound in much more comfortable accommodations. But it's amazing to walk through the camp with Mike, and everybody keeps going Abuna, Abuna, which Abuna means father, because he's such a beloved figurehead. And I know Mike goes way beyond in trying to accompany the people and help them and finding creative solutions out of the NGO and UN protocols that limit interactions with the civilians in the camp. And he's a beloved figurehead, and just to mention that it's only him and one other Komboni sister are the only religious in Malakal at the moment. The Komboni sister is the head of Caritas, and then Mike lives in the UN compound, but together they are a formidable team, and they're doing a lot of good. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And Mike not only is known as Abuna, as father in the camp, but when I was there photographing with him, he introduced me as Abuna, because a photographer isn't necessarily welcome, but if you're another Abuna, hey, welcome, one more Abuna. Another person that to me embodies accompaniment is Josephine, Sister Josephine Murigi, who's a Kenyan who lives and works in Rimenze and hasn't gotten sort of the attention of some other folks within Solidarity, but she has been there day in and day out teaching children and setting up an education system at times when Rimenze swelled with thousands and thousands of people who were displaced, and often with very few, if any, resources. Here she's teaching arithmetic to kids by counting bottle caps. That's the level of resources that she has. She's somebody that for me embodies a quiet kind of accompaniment that doesn't attract attention, but over time really affects change. And some of the students, the young people who she's had as elementary school students or in her preschool have gone on. Some of them are now studying to be teachers at the Solidarity School in Yambio. Another person who died recently is Sister Kathy Arata. She was from the United States. This is a woman who Nick Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times, nominated to be Pope years ago, something which really aggravated Kathy. She never, whenever I asked her about being nominated to be Pope, she just got angry and didn't want to talk about it. She was so humble. She was so humble that she wouldn't even eat. You'd sit at a table with this woman, and she would have the smallest portions, even though she was wasting away, even long before she became sick. But she had so embodied this sense of accompaniment that for her to eat very much in a country where people were going hungry, what violated her personal sort of sense of ethics. Kathy is somebody who she was humble about it, but never criticized. I'd sit beside her and drink beer and eat a lot, and she never criticized me. But with her life, she embodied this sense of accompaniment. And here she's walking inside one of the displacement camps in Juba, and you can see the containers stacked up on the right side there. Those are prevent bullets from coming into the camp. So you have folks like Rosa and Mike and Josephine and Kathy, who are the people who've made Solidarity work over the years. And I think they've made it work by a real sense of dedication and accompaniment of the people with whom they've worked. And that's rubbed off. It's rubbed off on some of the people who have graduated from the Solidarity institutions. This is Madalena Luis, who's a teacher, an Azande woman, a teacher in Yambio. This is a woman, I wrote a story for her for Solidarity. You can look on Solidarity's website to find it. She has a horrible history of being married to a guy that didn't want her to do anything. Didn't want her to be a teacher, didn't want her to leave home, didn't want her to go to a next door town to get a job, didn't want her to do this, didn't want her to work for an NGO. And she kept persisting. And her personal struggle is one that a lot of women who want to educate themselves in South Sudan face. And today, she's head teacher at a school in Yambio, and she takes particular interest and focus on making sure that the girls in that school know the importance of an education, and feel free to avail themselves of it. This is Abbas Daoud, who is a teacher from the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. Not only does Solidarity with South Sudan's ministry affect people living in South Sudan, but you get a few people from Sudan, for example, the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile regions. Abbas, this is where he's studying, a photo of him in class at the Solidarity Teacher Training College in Yambio. This is a guy who, as a kid, wanted to become a teacher. He wanted to learn, but his region of Sudan was constantly bombed by the Antonovs, by the government in Khartoum, and he was oftentimes on the run. He finally, in 2002, got to start in class, but then the fighting started up again. He moved to another town, went to class there for a little bit. He worked as he went through elementary school. He worked for Arab families there, doing laundry and cleaning their houses so he'd have money to pay his school fees. But when the fighting closed that down, he walked to Yida, which is a refugee camp inside South Sudan. But after several days of walking, he got there with the hopes of going to class. But he went to class and there were 150 students in each class. There was no way that he was going to learn, and there was no food. So he walked back home. For a few years, he borrowed a bicycle, and he would export and import coffee and sugar by riding his bicycle several days across the border to Bentiu, buying things and bringing them back and selling it. He finally goes to the refugee camp in Kakuma in Kenya. After a while there, he comes back, but then his priest sends him to Yambio, and he's learning to become a teacher. This is the kind of guy who for years and years has struggled to learn and is now, finishing his education and going back to be a teacher in his home community.
And this hunger for education was so apparent. So many South Sudanese travel long distances and choose to be refugees in Uganda or Kenya so they can get some basic education through very difficult circumstances, and many times much later in life than children would be going to school in other parts of the world. There's one teacher right now teaching in Yambio in the Solidarity School who's a former student, and he talks about going to school and then having to run out and dive into the river to dodge the bombers that were bombing the Nuba Mountains repeatedly, and then finally going to a refugee camp to get some primary school education. We have students who have been imprisoned because of mistaken identity for years and finally making their way to our institutions to get some education. So listening and talking to them, the South Sudanese are so ready to get the skills and the education necessary to change their country. It's just a lack of opportunities and sometimes competing priorities. Many of them are parents, and committing to study in Solidarity schools means committing to leave your home community for 2 to 3 years without going back. And that's kind of hard when you have children or other family members who are dependent on you to provide for them.
This is, on the left, is Rosalind Edwards. She's a midwife, a graduate of the Catholic Health Training Institute run by Solidarity. And wow, she wanted to be a nurse, but she had a baby of her own. She got pregnant and she lost the baby when basically the delivery was botched by bad communication among the hospital staff. There was a shift change and they didn't communicate to each other well. And that experience for her convinced her to change and become a midwife, because she realized that doctors didn't have time for patients oftentimes. There's not a lot of doctors in South Sudan, but that midwives played this crucial role of accompanying women through the process of giving birth and could facilitate communication and make sure the process went well. She remembers how she felt alone during the process of pregnancy and giving birth. And she's determined to not let women feel alone today. And so she's a graduate and now she's a midwife at the Kamboni Hospital in Wow. She, to me, is another example of the kind of students that Solidarity has worked with, people who you've been training to be leaders in their professions in the country in the years ahead. Another thing about Solidarity, and this is not my photo, it never occurred to me to take a photo sitting around the table eating with people at Solidarity. But at the different Solidarity houses, this table isn't like that, but a lot of them are round in Juba and in Wow. There used to be a round table in Malakal, but this may have been in Malakal. But it's a table which to me is symbolic because there's no head of the table. There's no hierarchy. Religious brothers and religious sisters and priests who are men in the Catholic Church, could come together in a setting with lay folks, and everyone was equal and they shared. And to me as a journalist, sitting around this table was a great place because it's where I learned what was going on. A lot of the interviews I made that I used in stories were made right after the meal ended, when I'd say, let's go sit and talk. So to me, the table has this round table or oblong table has become kind of a symbol for the solidarity community and the way they understood themselves as a community of people living together and working together without hierarchy, which is somewhat unusual in the Catholic Church and in Latin America. And they've tried to instill some of that sense in the work that they do of teaching people to be students or teaching them to be health professionals. For example, at the school in Mūmbi where they train teachers, every once in a while, they love an excuse for a party, the students will dress up in their clothing of their tribe, and they will share their dances with other students. And they'll learn each other's dances, which is not what people traditionally did in South Sudan. It breaks down some of the barriers caused by identity and forms community. And Solidarity with South Sudan has done a good job not only of creating this solidarity, this community among its workers, but also in the communities where it works, in the students, for example, in Mūmbi. Another comment I'd like to make, and we're getting near the end of my photos here, is about women and the attention of solidarity to changing the lives of women. And if you've been involved in development in third world settings, you know that resources are best dedicated to improving the lives of women and girls. If you spend money on men, if men end up with money, they're more likely to spend it on booze or drugs or other women or gambling, whereas women are going to spend it on their children. And this particular woman is Juliana John, who here she's gathering leaves to feed to her pigs. It's a project that she began with the help of the farm in Rumense, the Solidarity Project in Rumense. And with the proceeds that she gets from raising pigs and selling pigs, she has kept her children in school, particularly her girls. And she's been able to pay the school fees. She's been able to improve their nutrition. And when you can keep girls in school, you can slow down the problem of early pregnancies. There's a whole lot of things you can do. And it all starts with economic empowerment of women. And so that's something that Solidarity, I think, has really understood well. And it's a cross-cutting theme that has run through several of its programs.
So looking at this image, Paul, the image of the woman, I'm drawn because also of the building behind her at Tukul, because you were talking about one of the unsung heroes, Josephine, and one of the other projects she has is caring for the elderly who have no one in their families who can take care of them, and constructing such a Tukul for them, which to build it and to furnish it like with a bed and a mosquito net and everything it's just about $100. And being in the US, it's mind-boggling to imagine that $100 can construct a shelter. And when I met with the elderly that Josephine takes care of, the first thing they said before we talked about anything is, I hope you're not here to take Josephine away, which speaks to just what an impact she has made and the miles she covers walking from place to place to actually visit the different people and to establish what's going on so that a Tukul can be built. But also the woman carrying these are cassava leaves, which is really also eaten as a vegetable in not just in South Sudan, but many parts of Central Africa. And it's a versatile, here in the US, I think you call it yuca more, such a versatile food. But I also met another woman who cares for the pigs that she got from the Rumense project, like little babies. She even cooks for them like porridge because she really wants she wants the pigs to grow because she realizes this could change the trajectory of her family's life in being able to educate her grandchildren. Yeah.
One of the things that's impressed me, I mean, when you talk about people like Josephine, you talk about a really quiet woman who does a lot, who sometimes I would have to chase after her to find out what she did. She wasn't selling it. And you have a lot of folks who've come from different places around the world to just quietly be present with folks. One of them is this man, Christian Babam, who was a Marist brother from Nigeria. I confess I always had difficult with his English accent, but he was a wonderful, beautiful man. And in his experience in Ribense, which a lot of it just consisted in walking around and being with people, of sharing their lives, there came a time when rebels came through and invaded the compound, and basically they were men with guns who were threatening people. They killed a lot of people in the community. And there was one time when they held some people at gunpoint, and Christian came very quietly and just put himself in front of the people, put himself between the guns and the people. And he said, if you're going to kill them, you got to kill me first. And he did it without an exaggerated sense of bravado or of heroism. It was just simply the way he lived his life and the way he did his ministry. And solidarity has been blessed by people like Brother Christian, who've come to this country that isn't their own, to share the lives of people who have gone through tremendous suffering, and in the process have made a big difference. And so I give thanks for their witness and testimony, and for the opportunity to, over the years, to have been able to witness that in a variety of places. I'd like to end with this slide, which is a nighttime prayer vigil in a little village near Coron, where the Catholic Church is involved in peace building. Just to remind people that folks in South Sudan are praying for peace. They're not only praying, they're working to try to make peace and all that that entails. And as we in other parts of the world in our comfortable homes support them, we also need to pray for them, and actually joining our prayers with them, that peace somehow can come to South Sudan, that all those problems of corruption and the climate crisis and weaponry and tribal tensions can be overcome by a witness of love and of peace building. So thank you for letting me share with you some of these images.
Thank you, Paul. And truly the solidarity staff are wonderful. And I love the dinner table in Juba because that was always my return point from the different projects. I never knew who would gather around that evening, because Solidarity hosted not just Solidarity members, but so many other missionaries working in different parts of South Sudan. So every dinner time table, you never knew who you'd meet. And people came from such different parts of the world doing amazing work in South Sudan. And the conversations would cover, a gamut of things. And that's such a gift. And I'm not sure whether hospitality was something that they consciously chose as a solidarity value, but every single solidarity house you go to, you get radical hospitality. And what is more amazing is in such difficult conditions. I remember arriving in Yambio and Sister Elizabeth picking me up and offering me tea 30 minutes later in their house. And I don't know how we started talking about cake. And I mentioned I like chocolate cake. And that evening, there was a chocolate cake that she had baked. And when you think of Yambio, where you buy what you find in the stores, you don't necessarily go with a shopping list and hope you check every item off the list. It's even more amazing, the circumstances under which they are offering this hospitality. But Paul, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for sharing your experiences of South Sudan with us and these powerful, powerful images. I'm excited to see what other pictures you have. I took about 700 myself on my phone while I was there, but for me, it was always this trying to capture what I was feeling, experiencing my emotions in a picture. And then the picture failing to kind of live up to being there, feeling the heat on your skin and hearing, the birds and whatever animal you're hearing, but in a small piece, trying to bring that back so I can share it with other people who might not even know where South Sudan is, because the older Sudan kind of takes over and people are thinking of Sudan and they don't realize that this young nation exists in the world. I thank all of you who joined us today. Thank you for taking this time to be with us, and for supporting the mission of Friends in Solidarity and Solidarity with South Sudan, as we continue trying to build the capacity of the South Sudanese people to be agents of change in their own country. We are going to have another webinar coming up in May. And I hope you aren't tired of hearing me, because that webinar will feature me talking about my recent trip to South Sudan and just my impressions. As I tell my sisters in my community, I haven't finished processing South Sudan. That's why I'm not talking about it yet. So I'm hoping by May, I'll have a bit more processing done so I can talk a bit about the wonderful people I saw. And so many of them told me, tell them about us. Tell them about us. Tell them about the hope we have for our country, our desire for peace, our desire to coexist together. So that's what I'm going to try and do in my own limited way on May 16th. And this time we are trying something different, to hold it at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so that those who work 8 to 5 jobs hopefully might be able to join in. And I finish with these quotes. I was lucky enough to arrive with Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And Justin Welby said, nothing on earth can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Nothing can separate us from one another who share in that love. The blood of Christ unites us regardless of our differences. It is sufficient alone for our salvation. We need no other sacrifices. My sister and brother are never, never, never my enemies. Pope Francis said, hope is the word I would leave with each of you as a gift to share, a seed to bear fruit. As Saint Josephine reminds us, women, especially here, are a sign of hope. And in a special way, I thank and bless all the women of the country. He was referring to Josephine Bakita, who was South Sudanese. And Ian Greenshield said, there's a strong legacy of churches working together for peace and reconciliation in South Sudan. We hope to encourage the continued unity of churches for the common good in South Sudan, for justice and fullness of life for all the people. And we say amen to this, because this is our hope too, as we continue doing this work for South Sudan. Thank you, Paul, and thank you all. And I wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.